In a cramped apartment, a brilliant systems architect was about to receive the most devastating text message of her career. What started as monitoring systems while sick took a shocking turn when corporate betrayal arrived in 14 cold words. Julia Smith wasn't your typical tech employee. For 3 years, she had built Nexus Digital's entire infrastructure, known for creating systems others couldn't understand. When that termination text arrived Tuesday morning, Julia made a decision that would lead to complete digital annihilation. What began as a sick day would become the most devastating corporate meltdown in startup history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Julia Smith's laptop screen blurred as another wave of fever washed over her. The pneumonia had been building for weeks, a consequence of too many 18-hour days in Nexus Digital's poorly ventilated office, too much takeout, too little sleep. She'd finally admitted defeat yesterday and called in sick, but even now, wrapped in 3 blankets on her secondhand couch, she couldn't stop monitoring the systems she'd built. The customer analytics dashboard showed normal traffic patterns. Payment processing was humming along smoothly. The security protocols she'd implemented were blocking the usual attempted intrusions. Everything was running exactly as she'd designed it to run, even without her physical presence. Especially without her physical presence. Her phone buzzed against the coffee table. 9:47 a.m. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately. HR will contact you about final paperwork. David. Julia stared at the message, her fever-addled brain struggling to process the words. She read it again. Then, a third time. 14 words. 3 years of her life dismissed in 14 words, delivered with less ceremony than ordering a sandwich. Her access credentials had already been revoked. The notification appeared as she tried to refresh the main dashboard. Authentication failed. Contact system administrator. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was the system administrator. She had been the system administrator. Wessie. The memories flooded back unbidden. Her first day at Nexus Digital, when it was just David and 3 other people in a cramped WeWork space. We're going to revolutionize how small businesses manage their operations, David had said, his eyes bright with startup enthusiasm. We need someone who can build our entire technical infrastructure from scratch. Are you that person? She had been. God help her, she had been exactly that person. Julia remembered the late nights when she'd built their customer management system, writing code that could handle complex business relationships while remaining intuitive enough for a corner bakery owner to use. She remembered implementing the payment processing integration, navigating the labyrinth of financial regulations and security requirements that would have cost the company hundreds of thousands to outsource. She remembered David's promises. Once we get to Series A, we'll hire a proper engineering team. You'll be the CTO, of course. This is just the foundation stage. Series A had come and gone. Then Series B. The engineering team materialized as a handful of junior developers who looked to Julia to understand systems she'd built in marathon coding sessions they couldn't begin to comprehend. Security is expensive, David had said, when she'd proposed implementing proper backup systems and redundancy protocols. We'll get to it after the next funding round. That was 8 months ago. The vulnerabilities she'd identified and documented remained unfixed, her detailed reports buried somewhere in David's always overflowing inbox. Her phone rang. Elena Rodriguez. Julia let it go to voicemail, then immediately felt guilty. Elena was the only person at Nexus who'd ever asked how she was doing outside of work context. The only one who'd noticed when Julia started skipping the monthly team dinners, when she stopped participating in Slack conversations, when she began looking increasingly hollow-eyed in their brief video calls. The voicemail notification appeared. Julia played it. Jules, I just heard. This is insane. David didn't even tell the leadership team beforehand. I'm trying to get more information, but I wanted you to know that this is total bullshit. Call me back, okay? I'm worried about you. Julia's throat tightened. Elena would face her own consequences for this call. David had made it clear that employee loyalty meant loyalty to the company, not to each other. Elena had a kid to think about, child support payments, a life beyond Nexus Digital's dysfunctional ecosystem. She opened her laptop and began checking her equity statements, though she already suspected what she'd find. The numbers confirmed her worst fears. 3 years ago, her initial equity grant had represented 2.3% of the company. Through subsequent funding rounds she hadn't been properly informed about, her shares had been diluted to 0.4%. At current valuation, her equity was worth approximately $23,000, less than she'd made in 2 months at her previous job. Julia laughed, a sound that came out more like a croak through her congested throat. She'd literally built the foundation of a company valued at $40 million, and they'd paid her less than market rate while systematically reducing her ownership stake to almost nothing. Her laptop pinged with a system notification, not from Nexus Digital's corporate accounts, but from the personal GitHub repository where she stored her administrative scripts. David hadn't known about her personal accounts. Why would he? He'd never bothered to understand the technical infrastructure beyond the PowerPoint slides she'd made for investor presentations. Julia stared at the terminal window, watching lines of code scroll past. Database maintenance scripts she'd written to handle the massive customer data migrations. Security patches for vulnerabilities in third-party integrations. Custom APIs that allowed Nexus Digital systems to communicate with each other seamlessly. All of it still running. All of it still accessible through the administrative backdoors she'd built for emergency maintenance. Backdoors she'd documented and recommended securing in reports that David had never read. Her fever seemed to break all at once, clarity cutting through the haze of illness and shock. For the first time in months, Julia Smith smiled. She opened a new terminal window and began typing. Julia's fever had broken, leaving behind a crystalline clarity she hadn't experienced in months. She made tea with hands that no longer shook, her mind already categorizing and prioritizing with the methodical precision that had made her indispensable to Nexus Digital. She opened an encrypted notepad and began documenting everything. The core infrastructure she'd built over 3 years sprawled across her mental map like a familiar city. The customer database, with its PostgreSQL cluster and primary-secondary replication that she'd optimized for massive concurrent loads. The payment processing gateway with custom fraud detection algorithms that had saved the company hundreds of thousands in chargebacks. The analytics engine processing real-time data across 14 terabytes of historical information. The security layer handling authentication, authorization, and audit logging. The communication systems that integrated internal Slack channels with customer notification services. Each system represented months of work, hundreds of late nights, thousands of lines of carefully crafted code. Each system had been built with redundancy recommendations that were never implemented, security protocols that were deemed too expensive, backup procedures that existed only in her documented proposals. Julia's fingers moved across the keyboard like a pianist returning to a familiar piece. She mapped out every connection, every dependency, every single point of failure she'd warned management about. The company's infrastructure wasn't just vulnerable, it was actively fragile, held together by digital duct tape and her constant monitoring. Her destruction would unfold in 3 carefully orchestrated phases. First, she would target internal systems, Slack integrations, email routing, the custom dashboard that fed real-time metrics to David's wall-mounted monitors. Let them feel isolated first, cut off from the data streams they'd taken for granted. Next would come customer-facing degradation. Analytics dashboards would fail, non-critical features would start throwing errors, and the customer portal would become sluggish and unreliable. Nothing that would immediately hurt end users, but enough to generate support tickets and confusion that would overwhelm their understaffed support team. The final phase would target financial systems, the crown jewel of destruction. Payment processing would face systematic disruption of transaction flows, reversal of automated processes, and corruption of financial reporting data. Not theft. Julia had no interest in becoming a criminal, but enough chaos to cost the company millions and destroy investor confidence. Her phone buzzed. Kevin Walsh. Hey Julia, hope you're feeling better. Weird question. Did you update anything with the analytics cron jobs yesterday? Getting some strange timeout errors. Julia stared at the message. Kevin was a good kid, 23 years old, with student loans that kept him awake at night and an eagerness to learn that reminded her of herself 5 years ago. She'd spent hours explaining database optimization to him, walking him through code reviews, advocating for his promotion, when David wanted to hire someone more senior. Kevin would be the one trying to fix everything she was about to break. She typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "Nothing from me. Check the error logs for specific timeout patterns." It wasn't a lie. She hadn't updated anything yesterday. What she was planning for today was an entirely different matter. Another notification. Sarah Kim from HR, requesting an exit interview via calendar invite. The corporate machinery grinding forward, reducing 3 years of her life to checkbox items on a termination checklist. Julia declined the meeting without comment. She returned to her documentation, but Kevin's text had introduced an unwelcome variable into her calculations. The junior developers, the customer service team, Elena's staff, they would all scramble to understand failures they hadn't caused and couldn't fix. Elena herself would bear the brunt of customer anger, forced to provide explanations for technical failures she couldn't possibly understand. Julia opened a new document to assess collateral damage. The small business owners using Nexus Digital's platform weren't her enemies. Rosa Martinez, who ran a food truck empire across Austin and used Nexus to manage her supply chain. Dr. Hassan, who operated 3 dental practices and relied on their patient management system. The boutique fitness studios, accounting firms, consulting shops, hundreds of small businesses that had trusted Nexus Digital to handle their critical operations. They would suffer. Some might lose revenue, customer data, operational efficiency, but they would also be forced to confront the reality that they'd entrusted their business operations to a company with fundamental security flaws and a leadership team that prioritized cost-cutting over reliability. Even in revenge, Julia found herself thinking like a systems architect, developing strategies to minimize harm while achieving her objectives. She could structure the destruction to hit hardest during off-peak hours for most customer time zones. She could preserve read-only access to critical customer data while disabling management functions. She could ensure that customer notification systems remained functional, allowing Elena's team to communicate about service disruptions. At 6 p.m., she ordered Thai food and continued working. The delivery driver looked concerned when she answered the door in pajamas and fever sweat, but she tipped him well and closed the door on his worried expression. By 11 p.m., her plan was complete. 3 phases: precise timing, minimal customer impact, maximum corporate disruption. She'd built Nexus Digital's infrastructure like a house of cards, impressive from the outside, but designed with specific stress points that only she fully understood. Julia set her alarm for 4 a.m. Tomorrow, David Brennan would learn the true cost of dismissing irreplaceable talent via text message. Julia's alarm buzzed at 4 a.m., but she was already awake, staring at her laptop screen in the blue glow of pre-dawn San Francisco. Her fever had completely broken, leaving behind a clarity that felt almost supernatural. She'd been coding for 15 years, but she'd never felt this focused, this purposeful. She opened a terminal window and began. The first target was Nexus Digital's internal communication backbone, the custom Slack integration she'd built to route system alerts, the email forwarding that kept management informed of customer issues, the real-time dashboard feeds that populated the monitors in their conference rooms. Nothing customer-facing, nothing that would immediately cost money, but enough to blind the company to what was coming next. Julia's fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision. A few lines of code to corrupt the message routing tables. A simple database update to invalidate authentication tokens. A scheduled task deletion that would prevent automatic system health reports from generating. Within minutes, Nexus Digital's nervous system went dark. 3,000 miles away in Austin, Kevin Walsh arrived at the office with a large coffee and the particular anxiety that came from yesterday's unexplained timeout errors. At 6:30 a.m., he was always the first developer in the building, a habit born from student loan pressure and genuine enthusiasm for the work Julia had taught him to love. He opened his laptop and immediately noticed the silence. No morning system alerts in Slack. No automated deployment confirmations. No customer analytics summary that usually populated his dashboard by 7 a.m. Kevin tried refreshing the internal monitoring page. Connection timeout. He tried accessing the customer database directly through the admin panel. Authentication failed. He tried pinging the load balancer. Network unreachable. Huh, Kevin muttered, assuming it was routine maintenance Julia had scheduled. She often did system updates during off-peak hours, though she usually posted warnings in their shared calendar. He checked the calendar. Nothing scheduled. He tried calling Julia, then remembered she was sick. Instead, he opened the legacy monitoring system, an old dashboard Julia had built but rarely used anymore. Green lights across the board. Everything appeared normal from the customer perspective. XBY 8 a.m., Elena Rodriguez was fielding her third customer call about slow load times. By 8:30, it was 6 calls. By 9 a.m., her customer success team was drowning in support tickets about features that were acting weird and reports that weren't updating properly. Kevin, Elena called across the open office space, are you seeing issues with the analytics system? I've got customers saying their dashboard data is stale. Kevin looked up from his second monitor, where error logs were accumulating faster than he could read them. Yeah, I'm seeing some anomalies. Probably just a database sync issue. Julia usually handles this kind of thing, but... He gestured helplessly. Elena's stomach tightened. She'd been with Nexus Digital long enough to know that when Kevin said, quote, Julia usually handles this, it meant they were venturing into territory none of the remaining technical staff truly understood. Meanwhile, in the glass-walled conference room, David Brennan was deep into his pitch with Peterson Ventures, completely oblivious to the growing chaos outside. His laptop displayed carefully curated slides showing Nexus Digital's growth metrics, customer acquisition costs, and revenue projections. The real-time dashboards that normally fed these presentations were dark, but David had memorized the numbers anyway. We're seeing tremendous traction in the SMB market, David explained to the 3 partners across the table. Our customer retention rate is industry-leading, and we're processing over $2 million in transactions monthly through our platform. What David didn't know was that transaction processing had begun failing 20 minutes earlier. Julia had targeted the payment reconciliation system, introducing subtle errors that would cascade through the financial reporting infrastructure over the next several hours. Back in her apartment, Julia watched the destruction unfold through her carefully preserved administrative access. System logs streamed across her screen like a digital waterfall. Database connection failures were mounting exponentially. Background processes were timing out. The elegant architecture she'd spent 3 years building was developing precisely the stress fractures she'd designed into her attack. She felt a grim satisfaction watching Kevin's increasingly frantic attempts to restart services he didn't fully understand. His terminal commands appeared in the audit logs, correct procedures, but applied to symptoms rather than causes. Like trying to treat a fever without understanding the underlying infection. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Hey, don't know if you're monitoring, but we're having some system issues. Nothing urgent, but when you're feeling better, Kevin could probably use your input. Julia stared at the message for a long moment. Elena was trying to be considerate, not wanting to burden a sick colleague with work problems. She had no idea that her sick colleague was orchestrating those problems with methodical precision. By 10 a.m., customer complaints had escalated from slow load times to payment failures and missing transaction history. Elena found herself explaining technical issues she didn't understand to increasingly frustrated business owners who depended on Nexus Digital for their daily operations. Kevin had escalated from confusion to genuine alarm. The timeout errors weren't random, they were systematic, targeting specific services in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. But that was impossible. Who would attack their systems? And how would an external attacker know their infrastructure well enough to target such specific vulnerabilities? Julia initiated the second phase of her attack. Customer analytics dashboards began returning corrupted data. Automated reports started generating with missing fields. The recommendation algorithms that helped small businesses optimize their operations quietly stopped working. She watched David's investor meeting through the conference room's security camera feed, another system she'd built, and another administrative access point the company had forgotten to revoke. David was still talking confidently about their technical capabilities, unaware that those capabilities were systematically failing just outside his field of vision. As the morning progressed, the elegant facade of Nexus Digital's operation began crumbling. What had started as minor inconveniences was evolving into operational chaos, and Julia was just getting started. The real devastation was still to come. By 11 a.m., Julia initiated the most devastating phase of her digital assault. She targeted the payment processing core during peak business hours, when thousands of small businesses across the country were processing their morning transactions. Her approach was surgical, not stealing money, which would make her a criminal, but systematically corrupting the reconciliation processes that verified, sorted, and reported those transactions. The first sign of catastrophe appeared in Elena's inbox as an automated alert. Payment processing gateway, 847 failed transactions in last 60 minutes. Normal failure rates hovered around 12 per hour, usually due to declined credit cards or insufficient funds. 847 failures was not normal. Elena's phone immediately started ringing. Rosa Martinez from Austin Food Truck Collective was first. "Elena, honey, none of my morning customers can pay. Your system keeps saying, quote, processing error. I've got a line of 30 people and they're all getting pissed." Before Elena could respond, her other line lit up. Dr. Hassan from Dallas. "We can't process any patient payments. Your platform is showing successful transactions on our end, but the money isn't reaching our bank account. What's happening?" Elena's customer success team descended into chaos. Every incoming call brought reports of payment failures, missing transaction data, or reconciliation errors that showed customers being charged without businesses receiving payment. The kind of problems that could destroy small businesses in a single day. Kevin's monitoring dashboard looked like a Christmas tree of red alerts. Database connection pools were exhausted. API response times had degraded from milliseconds to minutes. The transaction processing queue, which normally handled requests in real time, had ballooned to over 15,000 pending items. "This is impossible," Kevin muttered, scrolling through error logs that multiplied faster than he could read them. The failures weren't random system overloads or external attacks. They were precise, targeting specific vulnerabilities in subsystems that only someone with intimate architectural knowledge could identify. Someone like Julia. The realization hit him like cold water. Kevin pulled up the administrative access logs, searching for any evidence of unauthorized entry. Nothing. But he knew Julia maintained personal development accounts for emergency maintenance. Accounts that were documented in security reports no one had ever bothered to read. David's investor presentation was interrupted by his phone buzzing insistently. He glanced down to see Elena's name and declined the call, flashing an apologetic smile at the Peterson Ventures. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Partners. Sorry, just operational updates. Our team is very thorough about keeping leadership informed. The phone buzzed again, then again. "Perhaps you should take that," suggested Margaret Peterson, the lead partner, noting the persistence of the calls. "We understand these things happen." David stepped out of the conference room with growing irritation. Before he could say hello, Elena's voice cut through. "David, we have a major crisis. Payment processing is failing across the entire platform. I've got hundreds of customers calling with transaction errors, and Kevin says the core systems are experiencing systematic failures." "Define two, quote, systematic failures," David said, still thinking this was a routine technical hiccup that could be resolved with a system restart. "David, listen to me. We've lost over $2 million in transaction processing in the last 2 hours. Customer payments are failing, but some charges are still going through without reaching business accounts. We might be looking at massive chargebacks, potential fraud liability, and a complete breakdown of customer trust." The color drained from David's face. $2 million represented nearly a month of total platform volume. "Get Kevin to restart the payment servers?" Run the emergency backup protocols. Kevin says there are no backup protocols for this level of failure. He says Julia built most of these systems and he doesn't have access to the core administrative functions. David felt the first stirring of genuine panic. What do you mean he doesn't have access? He's a developer. David, Julia built everything. The payment processing, the database architecture, the security protocols, the integration layers. Kevin knows pieces of it, but Julia never fully documented the administrative systems because you kept saying we'd hire more senior engineers after the next funding round. The implications crashed over David like a wave. Julia, who he'd fired via text message 12 hours ago. Julia, whose warnings about system vulnerabilities he'd consistently ignored. Julia, who had become so integral to their operations that terminating her was like removing the foundation of a building while people were still living inside. Kevin appeared in the hallway, laptop in hand, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 3 hours. David, I need to talk to you. The failures aren't random. Someone with administrative access is systematically targeting our most vulnerable subsystems. The attack patterns are too sophisticated, too targeted. This isn't external. What are you saying? I'm saying someone who understands our infrastructure better than I do is actively destroying it, and there's only one person who fits that description. David's phone rang. Dr. James Foster, their lead investor. David, I'm getting calls from other portfolio companies about Nexus Digital. Something about massive payment processing failures hitting the industry news feeds. Please tell me this is a misunderstanding. David looked around at the chaos erupting in his office. Elena fielding angry customer calls. Kevin frantically typing commands that weren't working. Customer success staff looking increasingly desperate as their phones rang nonstop. Through the conference room windows, he could see the Peterson Ventures partners checking their phones, probably reading the same news feeds that had reached Dr. Foster. Jim, we're experiencing some technical difficulties, but... Technical difficulties? David, TechCrunch just published an article titled, Nexus Digital Payment Platform Suffers Massive Outage. They're reporting that thousands of small businesses can't process transactions and that customer funds may be at risk. This isn't technical difficulties, this is a company-ending crisis. In her apartment, Julia watched the chaos unfold through multiple monitoring tools. News of the failures was spreading across social media faster than Nexus Digital's communications team could manage. Customer complaints were flooding their social media accounts. Industry blogs were picking up the story. Stock price feeds for publicly traded payment processors were showing upticks as investors anticipated customers fleeing Nexus Digital's platform. She'd built something beautiful and they'd discarded her like a broken printer. Now they were learning the difference between having technology and understanding it. Her laptop chimed with a new notification. Kevin was attempting to contact her through the Emergency Developer Communication Channel, a Slack workspace they'd set up for critical system issues that bypass normal corporate communications. Julia, I know what's happening. I know you're doing this. Please, can we talk? There are thousands of small businesses that depend on our platform. I understand you're angry, but innocent people are getting hurt. Julia stared at the message for several minutes. Kevin was right. Innocent people were getting hurt. Rosa Martinez's food truck customers couldn't pay for lunch. Dr. Hassan's dental patients were facing payment confusion that could affect their medical care. Boutique fitness studios were losing membership payments that they needed to make rent. But those same innocent people had been at risk all along, dependent on systems held together by Julia's unpaid overtime and expertise that the company had systematically undervalued. At least now the risk was visible. She typed back, "The systems are failing because they were never properly secured or backed up. I warned management dozens of times. Check the documentation folder on the shared drive. Every vulnerability I'm exploiting was reported and ignored." Kevin's response came immediately. "I believe you. But please, help me understand how to fix this. People are going to lose their businesses." Julia's hands hovered over the keyboard. Kevin didn't deserve this. Elena didn't deserve this. The customers didn't deserve this. But David Brennan absolutely deserved this. And sometimes collateral damage was the only way to expose systemic problems that those in power preferred to ignore. "The fix is simple," she typed. Hire competent technical leadership who listen to their engineering staff. Implement the security and backup protocols that were recommended months ago. And stop treating the people who build your company like disposable equipment. She closed the laptop and walked to her window, looking out at San Francisco's skyline. Somewhere in those gleaming tech offices, other brilliant engineers were being overworked, undervalued, and dismissed. Maybe today's destruction would serve as a cautionary tale. Or maybe it would just be Tuesday. At 2 p.m., Julia launched the final phase of her digital scorched earth campaign. She deleted the customer data encryption keys. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. 3 years of customer business intelligence, purchase patterns, financial histories, operational analytics that small businesses had relied on to make critical decisions became permanently inaccessible. Not destroyed, but locked behind encryption that would take decades to crack. Simultaneously, she disabled every security protocol she'd built. Firewalls went dark. Intrusion detection systems stopped monitoring. Authentication servers began rejecting all login attempts. Nexus Digital's infrastructure lay completely exposed to external threats, while being unable to serve existing customers. Kevin's screen filled with alerts he'd never seen before. Critical, all encryption services offline. Customer data access terminated. Security perimeter compromised. His hands shook as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just system failure. This was digital annihilation. "Elena," he called across the office, his voice cracking. "We need to evacuate all customer data immediately. Every security system just went offline. We're completely vulnerable." Elena looked up from her third consecutive hour of crisis management calls. Her customer success team had stopped trying to provide technical explanations and was simply apologizing repeatedly while promising updates they couldn't deliver. "Evacuate to where? And with what systems?" "I don't know." Kevin's voice pitched higher with panic. "Julia built everything. The backup procedures, the disaster recovery protocols, the security systems. She documented that we needed redundant infrastructure, but management said it was too expensive." David burst through the office doors, having abandoned his investor meeting when the Peterson Ventures partners received real-time news alerts about Nexus Digital's, quote, catastrophic platform failure. His normally perfect startup founder appearance was disheveled, sweat stains visible on his designer button-down. "Where's Julia?" David demanded. "Someone get her on the phone right now." "David," Elena said slowly, "you fired Julia this morning, via text message, while she was sick with pneumonia." The reality of his situation finally penetrated David's panic. He'd eliminated the one person who could potentially save his company, and he'd done it in the most insulting way possible. He pulled out his phone and called Julia directly. The number was disconnected. Dr. James Foster arrived at the office at 3:30 p.m., having driven directly from his Sand Hill Road headquarters, when news reports started mentioning potential data breaches affecting thousands of small businesses. He found David pacing frantically while Kevin and Elena coordinated what could generously be called damage control. "David, what the hell is happening here?" Dr. Foster's voice carried the authority of someone who'd built and sold 3 successful companies. "I'm getting calls from journalists asking about customer data security. I'm seeing social media posts from your customers saying their entire business databases have disappeared. I need answers." David tried to summon his usual charm. "Jim, we're dealing with a sophisticated cyber attack. Our technical team is working around the clock to restore services. This kind of thing happens to major platforms all the time." "Cut the bullshit." Dr. Foster's interruption was sharp. "I've been through real cyber attacks. This isn't random. Someone with intimate knowledge of your systems is systematically destroying them. Who had that level of access?" Elena stepped forward. "Dr. Foster, David terminated our lead systems architect this morning. Julia Smith built our entire infrastructure over 3 years. She'd repeatedly warned about security vulnerabilities and the need for proper backup systems, but those recommendations were never implemented." Dr. Foster's expression darkened. "You fired your lead architect? When was this decision discussed with the board?" "It wasn't," Elena continued. "I've been checking corporate communications. There's no record of board consultation, no technical assessment of the risks, no transition planning. David sent her a text message while she was homesick. Dr. Foster turned to David with the kind of controlled fury that venture capitalists reserved for founders who made catastrophically stupid decisions. You terminated critical technical staff without board approval, without understanding the operational dependencies, without any succession planning? David's startup confidence finally cracked. She was expensive. We needed to reduce headcount before the next funding round. I didn't think. You didn't think, Dr. Foster repeated flatly. You fired the person who built your entire company, and you didn't think about the consequences. In her apartment, Julia watched Dr. Foster's arrival through the security camera feeds that were still functioning. She'd specifically preserved certain monitoring systems to witness the full scope of the chaos she'd created. Her laptop displayed news articles updating in real time. Small business platform Nexus Digital suffers complete system failure. Thousands of businesses unable to access critical data after tech startup meltdown. Payment processing crisis raises questions about platform security. Her phone, which she thought was permanently disconnected, rang with a call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously. Julia, this is Dr. James Foster from Meridian Ventures. I'm at Nexus Digital right now trying to understand what's happened to our platform. I know David terminated you this morning, and I want you to know that decision was made without board approval and against our investment guidelines. Julia listened silently. I've seen the documentation Elena showed me, your security recommendations, your infrastructure proposals, your warnings about system vulnerabilities, all ignored. I understand why you're angry, and frankly, you have every right to be. Dr. Foster, Julia said finally, I spent 3 years building something I believed in. I sacrificed my health, my relationships, my financial security for this company. And this morning I was discarded via text message like a broken piece of equipment. I understand. But Julia, there are thousands of small businesses that depend on the systems you built, people who trust us with their livelihoods. I'm not asking you to forgive David. I'm asking you to help us save the customers who don't deserve to suffer for his mistakes. Julia stared out her window at the San Francisco skyline, where other companies were undoubtedly making the same mistakes with their own irreplaceable technical talent. Dr. Foster, she said, the systems can be rebuilt, but not by the people who destroyed them in the first place. Marcus Thompson arrived at Nexus Digital's headquarters at 6:47 a.m., his weathered face betraying no emotion as he surveyed the chaos in the lobby. Employees clustered around flickering monitors, their voices a mixture of frustration and panic. 23 years in cybersecurity had taught him to read a crisis like a crime scene, and this one screamed sophistication. Show me everything, he told David, who looked like he hadn't slept. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually pristine suit was wrinkled from the night spent in damage control. In the server room, Marcus methodically documented each compromised system. His fingers flew across his tablet, cataloging the systematic nature of the destruction. This wasn't random malware or script kiddie mischief. Someone had methodically targeted critical infrastructure with surgical precision. Your logs show the breach originated from administrative accounts, Marcus said, pulling up the forensic data on his laptop. 3 different admin credentials were used across a 6-hour window. The timing suggests someone with intimate knowledge of your security protocols. David shifted uncomfortably. We think it might be a disgruntled former employee. We had to let someone go recently. Julia Smith, Marcus interrupted, scanning the access logs. Network security analyst. Terminated 3 days ago. He paused, studying the data more carefully. But these attacks began using her credentials almost immediately after termination. That's unusual. See? I told you she was vindictive. Marcus held up a hand, his gray eyes sharp. Actually, that's what makes this interesting. A truly vindictive insider would typically wait, plan, cover their tracks better. This feels more like... He trailed off, scrolling through months of system logs. Like someone who expected to be caught. The pattern became clearer as Marcus dug deeper. Julia's fingerprints were everywhere, but so were dozens of unpatched vulnerabilities, ignored security recommendations, and bypassed protocols. Her digital signature was less like a criminal covering tracks, and more like someone leaving breadcrumbs. I need to see her personnel file, Marcus said. And any security reports she filed in the past year. David's jaw tightened. That's confidential. Mr. Lawson, your company just lost millions of dollars and potentially faces lawsuits from hundreds of clients. Confidentiality is a luxury you can't afford right now. An hour later, Marcus sat in Sarah Kim's office, a stack of documents spread before him. Julia's security reports painted a disturbing picture of systemic negligence. Vulnerability assessments marked urgent and dated 6 months ago sat unaddressed. Network security recommendations that could have prevented this exact type of breach were filed under budget pending with no follow-up. She warned you, Marcus said, looking up at Sarah, multiple times, about exactly the vulnerabilities that were exploited. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pointed to a memo dated 2 months prior. She said our multi-factor authentication was inadequate. That administrative accounts needed better oversight. David said it wasn't a priority, that we needed to focus on revenue-generating projects. Marcus pulled up another document, this one, a formal security assessment Julia had submitted just weeks before her termination. The report outlined a comprehensive security overhaul, complete with budget projections and implementation timelines. Stamped across the top in red ink. Rejected. Cost prohibitive. She didn't just warn you, Marcus said quietly. She gave you a roadmap to prevent this exact scenario. Meanwhile, across town in her sparse apartment, Julia sat transfixed by her laptop screen. The story had gone viral faster than she'd anticipated. #NexusDown was trending on social media, but as she scrolled through the posts, her satisfaction curdled into something darker. A food delivery service had lost 3 days of orders. A small nonprofit couldn't access their donor database before a crucial fundraising deadline. A freelance graphic designer had lost a week's worth of work when the cloud backup service went down. These weren't faceless corporations absorbing the cost. These were real people, small businesses, individuals whose livelihoods depended on systems she'd deliberately destroyed. One post particularly haunted her. A single mother explaining how she couldn't access her work schedule because her employer's system was down, meaning she might miss shifts she couldn't afford to lose. The woman's profile showed photos of 2 young children. Julia closed the laptop and stared at her reflection in the dark screen. When had she become someone who hurt innocent people to settle a score? Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Smith. This is Marcus Thompson, security consultant investigating the Nexus incident. I'd like to speak with you. Not about prosecution. About the truth. Julia stared at the message for a long moment. She'd expected police, lawyers, threats of legal action. She hadn't expected someone wanting to talk about truth. Back at Nexus Digital, Marcus was building a clearer picture of the company's culture. He interviewed the remaining IT staff, each conversation revealing the same pattern. Talented employees raising concerns that were systematically ignored by management, focused solely on short-term profits. Julia was the best we had, admitted Tom Rodriguez, the junior network administrator. She stayed late, caught problems before they became disasters, wrote documentation that actually made sense, but David treated her like she was being paranoid whenever she pushed for security improvements. Marcus nodded, making notes. What about after she was fired? Tom's expression darkened. David called an all-hands meeting. Said we needed to be more solution-oriented and less focused on doom and gloom scenarios. Pretty much told us to stop worrying about security and focus on keeping clients happy. The final piece of the puzzle came from Sarah Kim, who appeared at Marcus's temporary office setup with a manila folder clutched against her chest. I probably shouldn't be showing you this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I can't keep pretending everything was above board. The folder contained Julia's performance reviews, disciplinary actions, and termination paperwork. But more importantly, it contained Sarah's own notes, observations about David's increasing hostility toward anyone who questioned his decisions, documentation of ethical concerns she'd raised with the board that went unanswered, and a pattern of retaliation against employees who pushed back on dangerous cost-cutting measures. She wasn't fired for performance issues, Sarah said, her professional composure finally cracking. She was fired because David couldn't stand being told he was wrong. And now look where we are. Marcus closed the folder and studied Sarah's face. You know this could have been prevented. I know. Sarah's voice was hollow. I knew it then too. But I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to override executive decisions. I told myself I was just HR, that my job was to implement policy, not question it. And now? Sarah looked out the window at the protesters who had gathered outside the building. Small business owners affected by the outage, employees worried about their jobs, reporters documenting the company's fall from grace. Now I think keeping quiet makes me complicit, she said. Dr. Foster called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. They're going to want answers, and I'm going to give them the truth. All of it. Marcus spent the rest of the day analyzing the technical aspects of the attack. Julia's methods were elegant in their simplicity. She'd used legitimate administrative tools to systematically corrupt data, exploiting the very vulnerabilities she'd warned about. But the more he studied her approach, the more he realized something crucial. She'd been careful to target systems that could be restored, avoiding truly catastrophic damage that would be impossible to recover from. Restraint? Julia's voice cracked. I cost them millions of dollars. Small businesses lost revenue because of me. People missed work. People were already at risk because of the vulnerabilities you identified. Marcus interrupted. What you did was wrong, but it was also inevitable. If not you, then eventually a real malicious actor would have exploited the same weaknesses. At least your attack can be undone. The words hung in the air between them. Julia had spent sleepless nights wrestling with the consequences of her actions, but she'd never considered this perspective, that she might have been a symptom rather than the disease. Meanwhile, 3 miles away at Nexus Digital headquarters, Dr. Patricia Foster entered the executive boardroom with the measured calm of someone about to perform surgery. The board members were already seated, 5 venture capitalists and tech executives who'd trusted David Lawson to grow their investment. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Dr. Foster began, taking her seat at the head of the mahogany table. We need to discuss David's leadership in light of recent events. David sat to her right, his usual confidence replaced by defensive posture. He'd spent the morning preparing his narrative. Julia Smith as a disgruntled employee, the attack as an unforeseeable act of sabotage, his response as decisive crisis management. Sarah Kim entered quietly, carrying a thick folder that she placed in front of Dr. Foster. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. I've compiled documentation relevant to the board's discussion. Performance reviews, security assessments, and records of warnings that were dismissed. Sarah, I don't think, David started. Mr. Lawson. Dr. Foster's voice cut through his objection like a scalpel. Ms. Kim will present her findings, and then you'll have an opportunity to respond. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah methodically presented evidence of systemic negligence. Julia's ignored security recommendations. Budget rejections for critical infrastructure improvements. A culture that prioritized short-term profits over long-term stability. The documentation painted a picture of a CEO who'd gambled with the company's future and lost. These aren't the actions of one disgruntled employee, Sarah concluded. These are the predictable consequences of leadership that refuses to listen to technical expertise. David's face had grown increasingly red during the presentation. You're all acting like Julia Smith is some kind of hero instead of a criminal who destroyed our company. She broke the law. Yes, she did, Dr. Foster agreed. But the question before this board isn't whether she should face consequences. It's whether the leadership failures that enabled her attack should also face consequences. Back at the hotel, Marcus was showing Julia the broader context of her actions. His investigation had revealed that Nexus Digital wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a disturbing pattern in the tech industry where security concerns were consistently subordinated to growth metrics. You want to know what I think really happened? Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. I think you reached a breaking point where proving you were right became more important than following the law. I think you made a choice that brilliant people sometimes make when they're not being heard. You decided to make noise no one could ignore. Julia stared out the window at the city below. I destroyed my career. I'll probably go to prison. And for what? David's still CEO, the company will rebuild, and nothing will really change. Actually, Marcus said, checking his phone, I'm getting reports that the board called an emergency meeting this morning. And there's something else you should know. Drive. Foster has been building a case for months. Your attack didn't just expose technical vulnerabilities. It gave her the ammunition she needed to challenge David's leadership. Julia looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean, your former colleagues aren't the only ones who are concerned about the company's direction. Dr. Foster has been documenting David's decisions, waiting for the right moment to act. You may have inadvertently provided that moment. For the first time since their conversation began, Julia felt something other than regret. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that perhaps her actions might lead to changes she'd been unable to achieve through proper channels. What happens now? She asked. Marcus closed his tablet and studied her face. Now you decide whether you want to be remembered as the person who broke the law, or as the person whose technical expertise helped expose a system that was already broken. The prosecutors will make their decisions, but you still have choices about how this story ends. Outside the hotel windows, the city hummed with activity, thousands of people working in buildings that depended on secure networks, trusting that someone like Julia Smith was watching out for their digital safety. The question was whether anyone was listening. The Nexus Digital boardroom had never felt smaller. David Lawson sat at the conference table, his usual commanding presence reduced to defensive stillness as 5 board members delivered their verdict. Dr. Foster's expression remained professionally neutral, but her words carried the weight of finality. The board has voted, she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. Effective immediately, you're removed as Chief Executive Officer. The company needs leadership that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term gains. David's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally resignation. You're scapegoating me for the actions of a criminal employee. Julia Smith broke the law. Julia Smith exploited vulnerabilities you were warned about repeatedly, interrupted board member Robert Chen, his venture capital background evident in his blunt assessment. We've lost 3 major clients already, and our insurance company is questioning whether we exercised due diligence in cybersecurity. This isn't about blame, it's about accountability. Sarah Kim watched from her position near the door, clutching a box of tissues she hadn't needed. The relief she felt was overwhelming. For months, she documented David's disregard for expert advice, his pattern of dismissing concerns that threatened his narrative of unstoppable growth. Now that documentation had served its purpose. Dr. Foster will serve as interim CEO while we conduct a search for permanent leadership, Robert continued. Our first priority is implementing the security recommendations that should have been addressed months ago. David stood slowly, his expensive suit somehow looking cheaper in defeat. This company was nothing before I built it into a major player. You're destroying everything we've achieved. No, Dr. Foster replied quietly. We're trying to save what can be saved. Across town, Julia Smith sat in her attorney's office, staring at a plea agreement that would define the next chapter of her life. Margaret Winters, her court-appointed lawyer, had negotiated something unprecedented. Community service focused on cybersecurity education instead of prison time, contingent on her cooperation with improving corporate security practices. The prosecutor was impressed by Marcus Thompson's report, Margaret explained, pointing to specific clauses in the agreement. He made it clear that while your actions were illegal, they exposed genuine public safety issues. Companies across the industry are vulnerable to the same attacks you executed. Julia read through the terms again. 18 months of supervised community service, teaching cybersecurity awareness to small businesses and nonprofits. A permanent felony record. But no prison time. And most surprisingly, a consulting role with the State Attorney General's office to help identify similar vulnerabilities in other companies. They want me to help prevent what I did to Nexus? Julia asked. They want to harness your expertise legally this time, Margaret corrected. You've demonstrated that these security flaws exist, and that the consequences of ignoring them are severe. Now they want you to help fix the problem systematically instead of symptomatically. The irony wasn't lost on Julia. She'd broken the law to prove a point that proper channels had failed to make, and now those same authorities wanted her to work within the system she'd circumvented. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson. Saw the news about David. Thought you should know. 3 companies have already reached out asking for security audits based on my Nexus report. Your methods were wrong, but your warnings are finally being heard. Meanwhile, at Nexus Digital, the real work of recovery was beginning. Dr. Foster stood in the server room where the crisis had started, watching technicians implement the security measures Julia had recommended 9 months earlier. The multi-factor authentication system that David had called user hostile was being installed. Network segmentation that he deemed unnecessarily complex was being configured. Tom Rodriguez, now promoted to interim chief technology officer, worked alongside contractors to rebuild the damaged systems. It's going to take weeks to fully restore everything, he told Dr. Foster. But when we're done, we'll actually be more secure than we were before the attack. That's what Julia was trying to tell us all along, Dr. Foster replied, watching data streams flow across monitoring screens that finally had proper oversight protocols. The human cost, however, couldn't be as easily repaired. Dr. Foster had spent her morning on calls with affected clients, small businesses whose operations had been disrupted, nonprofits who'd lost crucial fundraising data, individuals whose work had been compromised by the outage. Each conversation was a reminder that technical decisions had real-world consequences. But there were positive outcomes, too. The security company that Marcus worked for had been flooded with requests from companies wanting to audit their own vulnerabilities. The tech industry was finally having conversations about the balance between growth and security that had been overdue for years. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Julia found herself in an unexpected place, testifying before a state legislative committee about cybersecurity standards for companies handling personal data. Her attorney had suggested it as part of her community service, but Julia discovered she had more to say than she'd expected. "I want to be clear," she told the assembled legislators, her voice steady despite the cameras recording her testimony. "What I did was wrong. Breaking the law is never justified, no matter how frustrated you are with systems that won't listen to technical expertise." She paused, looking at notes she'd prepared but no longer needed. "But I also want you to understand that this wasn't an isolated incident. Companies across every industry are operating with critical security vulnerabilities, because addressing them requires investment that doesn't show immediate returns. Until we change the incentive structures that prioritize quarterly profits over long-term security, we'll see more breaches, more data theft, more disruption to people's lives." In the audience, Marcus Thompson took notes on her testimony. He'd been asked to advise the committee on technical standards, and Julia's perspective, informed by both expertise and consequence, was invaluable. After the hearing, Julia walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt different than it had weeks earlier. Her phone showed missed calls from reporters, job offers from security firms, and messages from former colleagues who were finally free to express support they'd been unable to show while David controlled the company narrative. The consequences of her actions would follow her forever: the felony record, the professional reputation forever linked to the Nexus attack, the knowledge that her choices had hurt innocent people. But the consequences were also broader than she'd expected: systematic changes in how companies approach cybersecurity, new legislation requiring security audits, and a growing recognition that technical expertise needed to be heard before crises forced the conversation. It was the work of someone who wanted to prove a point, not someone who wanted to destroy lives. As evening approached, Marcus prepared his preliminary report. The truth was more complex than anyone wanted to admit. Julia Smith had committed a serious crime, but Nexus Digital's leadership had created the conditions that made it possible. She was a brilliant engineer pushed past her breaking point by a system that valued profit over people and ego over expertise. The real tragedy wasn't just what she'd done. It was that it could have been prevented if anyone in power had been willing to listen. Marcus picked up his phone and looked at Julia's contact information. Tomorrow, he would need to understand not just how she'd done it, but why she'd felt it was her only option. The technical investigation was complete, but the human story, the one that might prevent this from happening again, was just beginning. Julia Smith sat across from Marcus Thompson in a sterile conference room at the downtown Marriott, the neutral territory he'd suggested for their meeting. Sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished table that separated them. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from her Nexus days, and spent the time rehearsing explanations that now seemed inadequate. Marcus studied her with the same methodical attention he'd applied to the server logs. She was smaller than he'd expected, barely 5'4", with delicate features that made her look younger than her 31 years. But her eyes held a sharpness that spoke to the technical brilliance everyone had described. "I'm not wearing a wire," he said, placing his phone face down on the table. "This isn't about building a case against you, it's about understanding what really happened." Julia's laugh was bitter. "What happened is I destroyed a company's infrastructure because I was angry. Pretty straightforward." "No," Marcus said, opening a tablet and pulling up her security reports. "What happened is a brilliant engineer spent 3 years trying to protect a company that wouldn't protect itself. What happened is management ignored dozens of warnings until someone decided to prove those warnings were real." The directness of his assessment caught Julia off guard. She'd expected accusations, legal threats, maybe some attempt to get her to confess to additional crimes. She hadn't expected someone to validate her technical concerns. "You read my reports," she said, not quite a question. "All of them, including the ones David Lawson rejected without proper review." Marcus scrolled through the documents. "The multi-factor authentication gaps you identified in March, the administrative privilege escalation vulnerabilities from June, the network segmentation failures from September. Every single exploit you used last week was detailed in reports you submitted months ago." Julia felt something twist in her chest. A mixture of vindication and shame. "I told them. Over and over I told them." "I know. And I also know you could have caused permanent damage but chose not to. You corrupted databases that could be restored from backups. You disrupted services that could be rebuilt. For someone capable of truly devastating attacks, you showed remarkable restraint." Julia Smith had wanted to prove that the warnings were real. She'd succeeded, but at a cost that would take years to fully understand. 6 months after the Nexus Digital crisis, Julia Smith stood in front of a room full of small business owners in a community center in Oakland, her laptop connected to a projector displaying basic cybersecurity principles. The audience was diverse: restaurant owners, freelance consultants, nonprofit directors, all people whose livelihoods depended on digital systems they barely understood. "How many of you use the same password for multiple accounts?" she asked. Reluctant hands rose throughout the room. "And how many of those passwords include your business name or the year you started?" More hands, accompanied by nervous laughter. Julia smiled, remembering her own assumptions about security before she'd learned how vulnerable most people really were. "I'm not here to judge," she continued, clicking to the next slide. "I'm here because 6 months ago I made choices that hurt people just like you. Small businesses lost revenue, individuals missed work, and communities were disrupted because I decided to prove a point about cybersecurity by breaking it." The room grew quiet. Most of the attendees knew her story. It had been covered extensively in local media as part of the state's new cybersecurity awareness initiative. Some viewed her as a cautionary tale, others as someone who'd exposed important truths about corporate negligence. Julia had learned to live with both perspectives. "Today, I want to help you protect yourselves. Not just from people like me, but from the thousands of actual criminals who exploit the same vulnerabilities every day." After the presentation, Julia packed her equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given similar talks dozens of times. Her community service requirement had evolved into something more meaningful, a statewide program helping small businesses and nonprofits implement basic security measures they couldn't afford to hire consultants for. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson. "Saw your interview in TechCrunch. The industry recognition of your work is well-deserved, even if the path here was unconventional." The interview had been challenging. The reporter had pressed her on whether she regretted her actions, whether she felt the ends justified the means. Julia's answer had been carefully considered. She regretted the harm her actions caused innocent people, but she didn't regret forcing a conversation about cybersecurity that the industry had been avoiding for years. the numbers supported her impact. In the 6 months since the Nexus attack, cybersecurity spending across the tech industry had increased by 37%. Companies were implementing the kinds of proactive measures that Julia had been advocating for years. The California legislature had passed new requirements for security audits of companies handling personal data. The conversation had shifted from whether to invest in cybersecurity to how much was enough, but the personal cost remained high. Julia's felony conviction meant traditional employment was limited. Her consulting work was restricted to approved educational programs. She lived in a studio apartment, drove a 10-year-old Honda, and carefully budgeted every expense. The financial consequences of her choices would last for years. Meanwhile, Nexus Digital had not only survived but thrived under Dr. Foster's leadership. The company had rebuilt its infrastructure with the security measures Julia had originally proposed, positioning them as an industry leader in data protection. Ironically, the crisis had become a competitive advantage. Clients trusted a company that had learned hard lessons about cybersecurity over competitors who hadn't been tested. Tom Rodriguez, now permanent CTO, had instituted monthly security reviews where technical staff could raise concerns without fear of executive dismissal. The culture that had silenced Julia's warnings had been systematically dismantled and replaced with one that valued expertise over hierarchy. "We call them Julia Reviews," Tom had explained in his own TechCrunch interview. "Not to celebrate what she did, but to remember what happens when we don't listen to technical experts who understand risks better than executives understand profits." Sarah Kim had been promoted to Chief Human Resources Officer and had implemented policies ensuring that employee concerns about safety, security, or ethics had direct board-level oversight. She'd also established a whistleblower protection program that would have given Julia alternative channels for her concerns. But perhaps the most significant change was David Lawson's absence from the industry. His removal from Nexus had been followed by a broader recognition that his leadership style, prioritizing growth over stability, dismissing expert concerns, treating technical staff as obstacles to business objectives, was not only ineffective but dangerous. His attempts to find similar executive positions had been unsuccessful, as companies became more cautious about leaders who couldn't demonstrate understanding of operational risks. On a Thursday evening in late November, Julia received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. Dr. Foster stood in her doorway, looking older but more confident than she had during the crisis months earlier. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Dr. Foster said. "I wanted to speak with you in person." They sat in Julia's small living room, the evening light filtering through windows that overlooked a parking lot that had seen better days. The contrast with Dr. Foster's corporate world was stark, but neither woman seemed uncomfortable with it. "I want you to know that we're thriving," Dr. Foster began. "The security infrastructure you recommended has prevented 3 separate attempted breaches in the past month. Our clients trust us more now than they did before the crisis." Julia nodded. She'd followed the company's recovery through industry publications, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and regret with each positive development. "But I also want you to know that we failed you," Dr. Foster continued. "I was in a position to support your recommendations, to challenge David's dismissal of your expertise, and I chose institutional stability over doing what was right. I've had to live with the knowledge that if I'd acted sooner, none of this would have been necessary." "You couldn't have known I'd do something so destructive," Julia replied. "No, but I knew the vulnerabilities were real. I knew David was making dangerous decisions. I chose to work within a system that wasn't working instead of challenging it." Dr. Foster paused, studying Julia's face. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider consulting for us on a new project." Julia raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure my parole officer would approve of me working for my former victim." "It wouldn't be traditional employment. We're creating an industry consortium focused on cybersecurity standards. Companies sharing best practices, coordinating threat response, establishing baseline security requirements. We need someone with your technical expertise and your understanding of what happens when those standards aren't met." The offer hung in the air between them. Julia had spent months working within the system that had prosecuted her, teaching cybersecurity to people who couldn't afford proper protection. The idea of returning to high-level technical work was appealing, but the implications were complex. "Why me?" Julia asked. There are consultants with better reputations and no criminal records. Because you understand the human cost of security failures in a way that most consultants don't, Dr. Foster replied. Because you've seen what happens when technical expertise is ignored, and you've lived with the consequences of trying to force people to listen. Because the industry needs voices that prioritize security over convenience, even when those voices are uncomfortable to hear. Julia walked to her window, looking out at the city where thousands of businesses operated with vulnerabilities they didn't understand, where millions of people trusted systems that weren't as secure as they believed. The scale of the problem she'd tried to address with her illegal actions remained overwhelming, but perhaps there were legal ways to make a difference. I'll need to discuss it with my attorney and my parole officer, she said finally. And there would need to be transparency about my background. I won't pretend to be something I'm not. Of course, your story is part of why this initiative is necessary. We're not trying to rehabilitate your image. We're trying to learn from what happened. After Dr. Foster left, Julia sat in her apartment as darkness settled over the city. Her phone showed messages from people whose lives had been affected by her actions, some angry, some supportive, some simply seeking to understand. The single mother who'd missed work shifts had eventually sent a message saying she'd started using better password practices after learning about Julia's story. A small nonprofit director had thanked her for the free security consultation that had protected their donor database from a subsequent attempted breach. The consequences of her choices would follow her forever, but those consequences were more complex than simple punishment. She'd broken the law to expose problems that legal channels had failed to address. She'd hurt innocent people while trying to protect them from greater harm. She'd destroyed her own career while potentially saving others from similar destruction. Julia picked up her laptop and began drafting an email to her parole officer about Dr. Foster's offer. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time since the crisis began, she felt like she might be able to contribute to solutions rather than just highlighting problems. Outside her window, the city hummed with digital activity, millions of transactions, communications, and connections flowing through networks that were slightly more secure because of conversations her actions had forced. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something more valuable, the possibility that her expertise could finally be used to build rather than destroy. The story of Julia Smith would always include the night she chose to break the law to prove a point about cybersecurity. But perhaps it could also include the years she spent helping ensure that other technical experts wouldn't face the same impossible choice between being heard and being legal. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in months, Julia felt like she might have a role in writing it. 2 years later, the conference room on the 23rd floor of the San Francisco Federal Building buzzed with quiet conversations as cybersecurity professionals from across the state gathered for the quarterly meeting of the California Cybersecurity Consortium. Julia Smith entered carrying a worn laptop bag and a coffee that had gone cold during her morning commute from Oakland, where she now ran a nonprofit focused on digital security education for underserved communities. She took her usual seat at the end of the long table, still feeling like an outsider despite 2 years of proven contributions to the group. Her nameplate read, Julia Smith, Technical Advisor, with no mention of her criminal record or the Nexus Digital incident. The omission felt both generous and incomplete. Before we begin, announced Director Rachel Martinez from the State Attorney General's office, I want to acknowledge that this month marks the 2nd anniversary of the incident that catalyzed much of our work here. The Nexus Digital breach remains a case study in both the consequences of ignoring cybersecurity warnings and the complex ethics of how we respond when proper channels fail. Julia felt familiar eyes turned toward her, not judgmental anymore but acknowledging. Her story had become legend in cybersecurity circles, told in different ways depending on the audience. To some, she was a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking justice into your own hands. To others, she was proof that sometimes the system only listens after it's been shaken. Marcus Thompson, now the consortium's lead investigator, began his presentation on recent threat assessments. We've identified 17 companies with critical vulnerabilities, similar to those Julia documented at Nexus 2 years ago. The difference is that now we have legal frameworks to require remediation instead of waiting for someone to demonstrate the risks illegally. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The legislation that gave Marcus's team authority to mandate security improvements had been passed in direct response to Julia's attack. Her illegal actions had created the legal tools that now made such actions unnecessary. After the meeting, Julia walked with Dr. Foster to the building's coffee shop. Patricia Foster had kept her promise to transform Nexus Digital, and the company now served as a model for how organizations could balance growth with security. But more personally, she'd become something Julia hadn't expected: a mentor and, cautiously, a friend. "The Morrison Group wants to bring you in as a consultant," Dr. Foster said, stirring sugar into her latte. "Full consulting rates, 6-month contract, completely above board with your parole status." Julia raised an eyebrow. Morrison Group was a Fortune 500 company that had been resistant to cybersecurity investments until a competitor's breach cost them market share. What changed their minds? "Your reputation, actually. The nonprofit work you've been doing has gotten attention. Companies are realizing that someone who understands both the technical and human costs of security failures might be worth listening to." The offer represented something Julia had thought impossible 2 years ago: a return to high-level technical work that paid enough to move out of her studio apartment and maybe even start saving money again. But it also meant stepping back into the corporate world that had frustrated her into criminal action. "I'll need to think about it," Julia said. "I've gotten used to working with people who actually want to learn about security, not just check compliance boxes." "The world has changed, Julia. Companies aren't just checking boxes anymore. They're genuinely scared of what happens when they ignore expert advice. You helped create that fear." That evening, Julia sat in her apartment reviewing the Morrison Group proposal, while news played softly in the background. A reporter was covering another corporate data breach, this one at a healthcare company that had ignored security recommendations for years. The pattern was familiar, but the response was different. Instead of minimizing the breach or blaming external factors, the company's CEO was publicly acknowledging failures in cybersecurity investment and promising comprehensive reforms. Julia's phone buzzed with a text from Tom Rodriguez, now CTO at Nexus Digital. "Saw the Morrison Group news. You should take it. The industry needs more people who understand that security isn't just about technology. It's about listening to people who understand the technology." Another message came from Sarah Kim, who'd left Nexus to become Chief Ethics Officer at a tech startup. "Whatever you decide, remember that you've already proven you can make a difference. The question is what kind of difference you want to make next." The last message was from an unexpected source, David Lawson. After 2 years of failed job searches and industry exile, he'd started a small consulting firm helping companies avoid the leadership mistakes that had destroyed his career. His message was brief. "I finally read your security reports from Sen. 23. You were right about everything. I hope you get the chance to keep being right in ways that help people, instead of hurting them." Julia set down her phone and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights that represented millions of digital connections. Banking transactions, medical records, personal communications, all flowing through networks that were incrementally more secure because of conversations her actions had forced. The choice before her wasn't really about the Morrison Group contract. It was about whether she trusted herself to work within systems that had once ignored her expertise, whether she could advocate for security measures without the anger that had driven her to destructive action, whether redemption meant returning to the world that had rejected her, or continuing to build something new outside it. Julia opened her laptop and began typing a response to the Morrison Group offer. After 2 years of community service, nonprofit work, and careful rehabilitation of her professional reputation, she was ready to test whether the industry had truly learned from the crisis she'd precipitated. Her acceptance email included one condition: complete transparency about her background with all stakeholders. She would consult for Morrison Group as Julia Smith, former Nexus Digital employee who had served a felony sentence for cybersecurity crimes. No hiding, no euphemisms, no pretending her expertise came without a complicated history. If they still wanted her expertise after acknowledging her past, then perhaps the industry had genuinely changed. If not, she had meaningful work with her nonprofit, and the satisfaction of knowing she'd helped create a world where other technical experts might never face the impossible choice between being heard and being legal. Julia sent the email and closed her laptop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply her hard-won understanding of cybersecurity's human dimensions. The story that began with anger and destruction had evolved into something more constructive, though the scars of her choices would always remain. Outside her window, the city continued its digital dance, slightly safer because someone had been willing to break the rules to prove the rules were broken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.